Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. My name is Hisham Salem, and I'm the Associate Director of the Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our talk today, Marketing Democracy, the Political Economy of Democracy Aid in the Middle East. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank our co-sponsors, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, as well as the Center for African Studies, both at Stanford University. Thanks to both of them for making this event possible today. Our speaker today is Dr. Erin Snider, who is an assistant professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Her research focuses on the political economy of aid, democracy, and development in the Middle East. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Niehaus Center at Princeton University, a Fulbright scholar in Egypt, a Gates Scholar at the University of Cambridge, and a Carnegie Fellow with the New America Foundation in DC. Her research was featured in a variety of journals, including ISQ, Political Science and Politics, and Middle East Policy. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Cambridge and a master's in Middle East politics from SOAS at the University of London. Her first book and the subject of her talk today is Marketing Democracy, the Political Economy of Democracy in the Middle East. It was published with Cambridge University Press literally just this month. And without any further ado, I'll hand it off to Erin. Erin, it's all you.
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who have taken the time out of their schedules to join us. I'll apologize preemptively for any sounds you hear from suburbia here, including a dog as well, who should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here and try and get things started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and to thank Hisham as well for the kind invitation to join this webinar today. I'm absolutely thrilled for the opportunity to talk about my first book, Marketing Democracy, the Political Economy of Democracy Aid in the Middle East, which, as Hisham noted, was literally released just a couple of weeks ago with Cambridge University Press's Middle East series. Essentially, in a nutshell, this book is about the construction and practice of democracy aid in the Middle East, as well as the politics of democracy aid in authoritarian states, and how we think about the concept of democracy underlying democracy aid programs. So to understand the motivations for this book, let me take you back to the somewhat halcyon days of 2006. So in the mid-2000s, many of you might remember that the US government at this time was beginning to devote much more resources for democracy promotion abroad, particularly in the Middle East. And scholars as well were beginning to devote much more attention to trying to understand the impact and the effectiveness of spending on democracy, on democratization itself. This was also a time when we started seeing some backlash against democracy aid, maybe more robustly from governments in the Middle East, as well as more critical analyses by scholars of this aid as well. So in 2006, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is the primary agency, U.S. government agency managing democracy aid, commissioned a really sophisticated cross-national quantitative study of its efforts to promote democracy worldwide, and asking essentially if their spending on democracy aid was resulting in democratization. Again, a very sophisticated study with over 700 variables to try and get at this question. The study, which was later published in World Politics, found essentially that spending on democracy works, with the exception of what the authors then called, quote, difficult contexts like the Middle East. So nearly $2 billion had been spent up to that point on democracy aid in the region from 1990 to 2006. Yet the impact of that aid was limited, not only, of course, in their findings in the study, but for essentially anyone who was spending significant time on the ground in the Middle East, and particularly in Egypt, where I first began some of my field work. So the questions and puzzles at the outset of my project are the following. The first, Again, why have democracy aid efforts had such seemingly little impact in the region? And second, a question that seemed in some ways obvious, yet sort of fundamentally missing from a lot of the literature examining this aid. Why would authoritarian regimes even allow or tolerate these programs, right? So many of the most preeminent scholars of democracy promotion, of course, have noted that this aid is essentially about challenging the structure of power, right? And so if it's about challenging the structure of power, why would these regimes allow this aid to even operate in their states? So some initial explanations. Many scholars, of course, especially of the Middle East and North Africa, would note that security is certainly part of the equation, especially in thinking about the United States' geopolitical and strategic interest in the region. Many scholars have written on this point. And security is certainly an important part of the story, as I definitely address head on in the book. But at the time when I was initially beginning fieldwork in Egypt and later in Morocco, I felt that part of the story was missing, or that explanations for why aid wasn't supposedly working seemed in some ways overly simplified in the discussions that people were having at that time. So on the one hand, some academic studies were, as I mentioned, suggesting that this aid worked. And on the other hand, some scholars adopting a more critical approach on this aid were saying that, look, this aid isn't working because it was never intended to work. Somehow suggesting in some ways that there's, a person in a back office in the State Department or in USAID deliberately trying to subvert democracy or democracy programs in the region, which I think, as an aside, ascribes far too much coherence to be sure about what people in DC were doing then and also now. So sort of missing from this conversation were some things that I was noticing. First, that groups on the ground did see some utility with some forms of this aid, that many groups were not necessarily opposed to particular forms of democracy aid, but they did have major issues with the approach that was taken by donors, so not just the United States, but by other donor states as well. That their needs and concerns weren't driving the process, which they thought should have been the most preeminent concern, or that the interests of the donor, in this case, the United States, seemed at a profound disconnect with the realities of civil society and the political landscape at that time. So how I approach this question of understanding the limited impact. Initially, I saw this as a problem that could be solved if I could simply find, assemble, and analyze data on democracy projects in the region. But the reality, as I discovered, was far more complicated. So really fine-grained data on democracy projects, not just how much was spent on particular projects, but which organizations were receiving the money, which contractors were executing the projects, what the projects were themselves, was extremely difficult to find. Not impossible, but difficult. And US officials that were involved with such aid in the field were often really hesitant to share it, much less discuss it, which seems odd to many people given the orientation of this aid and what it's supposed to be doing. In other words, who would make the argument that these things should be much more transparent. Aid recipients and civil society activists in Egypt and Morocco also had profoundly different ideas about the utility of democracy aid and as well as its underlying motivations. So these complications and exclusions, primarily from US agencies and organizations, to me at that point signaled a far more interesting and complex story, and one that was really missing from the existing scholarship on this form of aid. So in this book, I sort of take a turn and challenge existing approaches to studying this aid. I argue that if we really want to understand how this aid may have had a limited impact in the region, we should really be looking at how democracy aid projects were constructed, negotiated, and executed over time. I tackle these questions by advancing a political economy framework that really considers how ideas, interests, and institutions mediate and shape the form and function of democracy aid programs on the ground. So in the book, I developed this framework to examine the design and implementation of the United States' past efforts in Egypt and Morocco, which had been two of the highest recipients of US democracy aid in the region. So in the book, I note that previous studies have, by and large, paid inefficient attention to the fact that democracy aid programs are negotiated deals, right? So as I show in the book, recipient governments can and do help craft their design. So this has a number of implications. The first is that the agency and the strategic behavior of recipient states can help us understand some of the null effects of democracy aid in some countries, right? So essentially, because authoritarian states may choose how to accept aid, democracy aid may end up rewarding economic interests tied to incumbent regimes. So rather than promote democracy, such aid can perversely undermine it. Again, somewhat unconsciously and against some of the prerogatives of some of the many people that have been engaged with this aid over time. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about this framework and how I'm approaching the study of democracy in the region, and how it addresses some of the limitations and the weaknesses and the challenges essentially of studying this form of aid. So with the political economy framework, I highlight in the book, again, some of the limitations and weaknesses with current approaches to studying democracy aid, and show how existing research on such aid thus far has really elided the contested meaning of democracy itself, as well as some of the assumptions underlying these democracy aid projects, these assumptions about how these projects are supposed to work in practice. So I argue that a political economy approach to the study of democracy aid is one that really allows us to take such meaning seriously, while also giving us a far more nuanced understanding of the motivations and the intentions from both the donor and the recipient side. And this is something that to date has been really hard to capture, with some studies focusing on one end or the other. And so again, in this book, pointing to the necessity of trying to understand how this aid is executed on both the donor and recipient sides. So the utility of this framework is that it really allows us to engage questions of meaning and power in the provision of democracy aid, while also deepening our understanding of how this aid works, especially in authoritarian states and the challenges therein. So examining how ideas, interests, and institutions interact to mediate and shape the form and functions of democracy programs, again, illuminates our understanding of why authoritarian regimes would even allow such programs, and why the interest of donor and recipient states, rather than indigenous demand, drives democracy programs over time. So essentially, insights from all three approaches allow me to really capture the richness and the complexity inherent in the politics of democracy aid in the Middle East, again, which has often been absent in some of the work trying to understand how this aid works. And again, one of the strengths of this framework for examining democracy aid is that it, again, explicitly confronts questions of power and meaning in the execution of such aid. So I just want to talk for a few minutes about some of the methods I use in this book to get at some of these questions and through this framework. So the work in this book very much follows an interpretivist approach that underscores how studying the practices of the actors engaged in democracy aid can really help illuminate the ideational and the institutional factors that are shaping democracy aid in the Middle East. So one of the really great benefits of studying practices, and when we talk about practices, what we're talking about are patterns of activities, essentially ways of doing things, is that it allows us to see how all of the different actors that are engaged with this form of aid interact with each other, how they see themselves within their respective institutions, and sort of the larger constellation of the field that they inhabit as well. So when we talk about studying practices, this means we can look at how people are doing things, what sort of norms exist in this area through a number of areas. We can study practices through participant observation, through interviews, through textual analysis, through diplomatic cables, through meeting and conference minutes and transcripts, as well as government reports as well. So how do I do this? All right, so in the research in the book, I'm drawing on years of archival research, so primarily at the National Security Archives in College Park, Maryland, recent declassified government documents, FOIA requests, so Freedom of Information Act requests, and over 2 years of cumulative fieldwork in which I conducted over 150 interviews with development practitioners, diplomats, activists, activists both in Washington, D.C., as well as Morocco and Egypt. I also draw on data that has been scraped from the professional networking site that I think many of you all are probably familiar with, linkedin.com, to try and map the movement of nearly 2,000 professionals that have been working in the field of democracy and governance since 1990 as well. So leveraging over a decade of field and archival research, I show how ideas about democracy were formed and how they were contested. And this is something I think that is often missed as well too, that there was a great deal of contestation over the ideas about democracy over time, and how these strategies developed to challenge restrictive regimes against changing institutional contexts, again, roughly since 1990. In the book, I show the evolution of what were truly rich discussions happening in DC and also on the ground, and debates about how to orient democracy programs in the region. And so in the book, I have a lot of detail about how this was contested, you know, even in discussions not about the Middle East, but of discussions that AID bureaucrats were having about how to construct democracy programs in Latin America, for example, and tensions bureaucratically about what to focus on and why, which I'm happy to elaborate more perhaps in the Q&A session. But in the book, the focus is not limited to bureaucrats within USAID, but it extends to a much larger constellation of actors that have been involved with this aid. So again, here I'm thinking about diplomats, contractors for USAID projects. So these are both for and not-for-profit actors that have been executing the majority of USAID's projects since the mid-1990s. Democracy advocates, both in the United States and abroad, local activists, and in diplomatic parlance, local nationals, Egyptians and Moroccans, working within the missions of both USAID and the US embassies. So in doing so, my book is really, I think, the first to try and offer insight into what many scholars have called the black box of relations between donor and recipient governments and civil society in the Middle East as it pertains to democracy aid. So in a nutshell, I'll just talk briefly about some of the findings from both case studies. In both Egypt and Morocco, democracy programs, US democracy programs, overall were framed in terms of their benefit to the economy, right? So this orientation at the time very much reflected an institutional preference in the United States for a market-oriented democracy, as well as a strategy, and a very clear strategy at that, to sell democracy programs to resistant regimes. So since the early 1990s, both states were able to essentially appropriate different elements of democracy aid to help bolster their control over society. They've done this in a number of ways. As one example, by using support for civil society to help fulfill government social welfare functions. And this is one particular case I'm thinking of in Egypt, but there's also examples of this in Morocco as well. So US programs that were aiming to promote democracy often ended up reinforcing structures that they intended to challenge. And this, again, at great frustration by a number of individuals embedded at different layers within the government. So again, both bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and also both Americans and local nationals working in both countries as well. So the findings in this book suggest that dependency matters in understanding an authoritarian regime's ability to challenge democracy aid programs, but that this is also contingent on the availability of other potential patrons to act as a surrogate for donor aid. So beyond suggesting evidence of some of the limits of linkage politics and foreign aid, my book also illuminates why democracy efforts have been limited through both the conceptualization of democracy promoted over time as well as the subsequent dilutions, right? The real watering down effects that regimes were able to make to aid programs, again, since the very beginning of programs in the early 1990s. So while again, this book is in general about the construction and the practice of democracy aid in the Middle East, it is also very much about the role of ideas in such aid more generally. And this is an area that's long been fascinating for me in the study of ideas and international relations and foreign aid, again, more broadly. To date, really, from my perspective, little attention has really been devoted to understanding how the ideas about democracy underlying democracy aid programs themselves are formed and how they're shaped by those executing the projects. So examining the political economy of democracy aid in the Middle East shows us which ideas about democracy win and why in democracy program. And again, many who are joining us on this webinar are, of course, probably familiar with the fact that there are a number of conceptions about democracy that exist, ranging from procedural and liberal forms of democracy to what we would call maybe more social democratic notions of the concept. So through some of my work, again, archival work, field research, and novel data on the professional histories of 2,000 professionals working in democracy promotion, I show in the book that the ideas that ultimately won were often those privileging a market economy. So the prevalence of these ideas wasn't just the result of bargaining processes, right, between the United States and recipient regimes, so both states in Egypt and Morocco. They were also very much a function of changes to the structure of the foreign aid bureaucracy and democracy fields within the United States. And at one point in the book, I make mention of the fact that the domestic and the international are inextricably linked in democracy aid. And this, again, gets right to that point. So programs that were privileging market reforms were ultimately easier to sell to authoritarian regimes who were already undergoing neoliberal economic reforms, so both Egypt and Morocco in this case. They were also much easier to sell among domestic actors in the United States as well. So in the book, I show, perhaps somewhat pessimistically, why such ideas are unlikely to change, given the institutional incentives governing actors that have been engaged in democracy programs over time. So over time, institutional changes to the administration of foreign aid brought USAID, again, the primary US agency managing democracy aid programs, under the control of the US State Department. And this began in the mid-1990s and accelerated thereafter. The cultures of both government agencies are, of course, profoundly different, right? So as an agency focused on development, USAID sees its work in very much long-term time horizons. The State Department, however, is necessarily focused on the short term, given the nature of its work, including maintaining good relations with recipient states. So in my work, I found that tensions rising from this cultural difference became much more pronounced in the early 2000s, particularly in negotiating democracy aid programs with governments in both Egypt and Morocco. And the impact and the effects of this change on USAID's democracy work were significant. So USAID lost substantial development expertise through budget and staff cuts that began in the mid-1990s and again accelerated thereafter, with much of its democracy work contracted out to and not-for-profit organizations whose own interest, it's important to note, I think, did not necessarily align with those of USAID. So again, the field of these actors are changing, and the foreign aid bureaucracy in general is changing. And this, has an effect, as I note in the book, on what's happening on the ground. Right. So I want to take a couple moments to bring your attention to this visualization, which I hope through Zoom is a little bit easy to discern. So this particular visualization shows some movement between some of the main actors that have been engaged in democracy promotion activities over time. So in the pink or reddish colored circles, you'll see US government agencies, those in blue, organizations linked to the National Endowment for Democracy. And those circles in yellow you'll see are organizations that are part of for and not-for-profit organizations that have been engaged in doing some of the work for democracy promotion activities for various agencies, including USAID and the State Department. And so looking at the changes to the movement of professionals working in democracy promotion suggests some of the changes to these fields and to changes in the foreign aid bureaucracy and the privatization of implementation and evaluation activities. So as the figure shows, there was significant movement among for and not-for-profits working with USAID. Just as an example, you'll note one of the larger circles amongst the yellow is that of Chemonics International, which is a for-profit company that's been executing a number of USAID's projects. And the heavier gray lines denote higher circularity, right, between individuals who are moving between, let's say, one agency, USAID, and Chemonics as well. So again, we can make some inferences from this visualization and some others that I have in my book. So resource constraints and diminished authority to actors like the State Department and to the US Congress led USAID to rely much more heavily on a core group of actors to run its democracy program. So one impact of this change, just as an example, some of those actors in some cases had little incentive to share lessons from their work to enrich AID's programming. And audits that USAID carried out on its own work showed that many of these groups withheld information to preserve their strategic advantage in maintaining work with USAID against similar competing groups, right? So a process that was meant to sort of enrich the learning process to help USAID refine its understanding of which programs were working on the ground, the impact of those programs, in some ways being stymied by the institutional structures that were in place as a result of these changes. One thing that's important, I think, to note, again, from this visualization, is that it's impossible to know the individual beliefs of those professionals that are captured in this particular visualization. But through repeated interaction with USAID, for example, we can appreciate, I think, how actors might learn to market their knowledge and use their understanding of the scripts and codes, particular to USAID, to secure grants and contracts over time. I'll just give you one example that I have in the latter chapter of the book of a local national, an Egyptian employee of USAID in Cairo, who was noting with frustration some of this dynamic and its impact on the ground. So she noted, quote, the culture of USAID was far more accepting of foreigners, and that she tried to encourage the agency to devote much more time and resources to working with local organizations to help them write competitive grant applications in both Arabic and in English. In her words, quote, Egyptian civil society has great ideas, but they don't know how to write. Americans know how to write, but they don't know how to implement programs, and they don't know Egypt. So again, kind of reflective, again, of changes that are happening on the ground. And this that quote in particular was from, I think, about 2008. So one result of the resource cuts that I mentioned and USAID's real demotion within the foreign aid bureaucracy was a real loss in the constituency for locally driven, nuanced democracy programs. So even before resource cuts constrained USAID's capacity to engage in the way it wanted, staff members were already under deep pressure from their superiors to orient programs in ways that ensured a continued funding from Congress. In the field, on the ground in both Egypt and Morocco, that same pressure very much affected both how local nationals and Americans working for USAID approach potential democracy programs, really increasing the pressure to construct programs that recipient regimes would tolerate. So in the book, I show how actors at the micro, the meso, and ultimately the macro level navigated what were, again, very complex and changing fields in democracy aid in both the United States and the Middle East. So closely examining their responses to those changes in the domestic arena again, in Washington, D.C. and in the field, shows us the impact of these institutional changes in incentivizing some forms of democracy over others in democracy programming. So again, on a somewhat pessimistic note, altering those incentives, I think, will be, extremely challenging. But the lessons and the findings drawn from my work really underscore the importance of a fundamental shift in how the U.S. conceptualizes democracy aid in both the U.S. And the Middle East, and especially in restrictive political contexts, and how it approaches issues of impact and measurement in democracy aid as well. So we've learned a lot of really important lessons from scholars of international peacekeeping in terms of how we think about impact and measuring effectiveness. So these scholars have shown us, perhaps not surprisingly, that such efforts are more effective when they involve some element of local ownership over the process or are otherwise adapted to local contexts, which I think for most of us makes good sense and seems fairly intuitive. Democracy aid programs that privilege local context and input seem far more likely in states that are highly dependent on US donor aid, but have low strategic value. So more possibilities, and I note in the book, might exist in such states for programs to be driven by and to be more responsive to local contexts. Such states, I think, are really ideal cases for scholars to really explore and test whether democracy aid programs are actually responsive to local context and concerns in these states. So again, these claims, I think, point to a really rich and promising area for scholars to explore towards understanding how democracy aid works in hybrid regimes beyond the Middle East, in which I've already begun to explore in new work examining the politics of transitional aid in the Arab world after the 2011 uprisings. So just to sort of conclude, by focusing again on the practice and the construction of democracy aid, my book ultimately contributes, I hope, to a more enriched understanding of the processes and mechanisms at work on both the recipient and donor ends, which again, I think has been underdeveloped in both the democracy aid and civil society aid literature. And the findings, I think, really challenge how scholars and practitioners of democracy aid think about the practice of democracy aid and are really important for refining our understanding about the role of outside actors in the execution of this aid, again, particularly in challenging or restrictive contexts. So one of the findings from this work is, again, from both my experiences in both Egypt and Morocco, when we talk about democracy, we're all not talking about the same thing. This was something that was echoed by countless individuals that I spoke with on the ground who had very different ideas about the forms of democracy that were being promoted. And the question might be, why does this matter? The focus is on making aid more responsive, but also a renewed focus and importance on thinking about the quality of democracy that's promoted by donors as well too. So making democracy aid programs, again, more responsive to and driven by local demand. This, I think, is hugely important as the United States, states in Europe and other donors are trying to make this aid responsive and trying to rise to the challenge in the last few months in particular, as we've seen more regressions and backsteps really in democracy and the rise of new forms of authoritarianism throughout the world as well. So the goal of this book, again, is to challenge how we think about effectiveness in democracy aid, but also very much the visions of democracy advanced by donors too. So I'd be very glad to elaborate on anything, and I think probably I'll stop there, and it'd be great to hear questions from folks as well.